The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, stronger and more united than ever before. "So," James said, moving to sit beside her at the kitchen table, "how are you feeling?" Emma took a deep breath, considering the question. "Scared," she admitted. "But not alone, not anymore." James reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're not alone," he affirmed. "We're in this together, every step of the way." As they sat there, father and daughter, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult decisions and unexpected obstacles, but they would face it as a family, united, resilient, and bound by love. He turned back to the house, where Emma was waiting in the kitchen. As he met her eyes, he saw a glimmer of hope there, a strength that had been absent that morning. They exchanged a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they were embarking on together. "The way you're standing by Emma, it's what she needs right now." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I should have been there for her all along," he admitted, the regret heavy in his voice. Margaret squeezed his arm. "You're here now," she said firmly. "That's what matters. You two are going to need each other more than ever in the coming months." As he watched his parents drive away, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. When his parents finally stood to leave, hours later, the atmosphere in the house had transformed. The fear and uncertainty that had permeated the air that morning had given way to a cautious optimism, a sense that together they could face whatever lay ahead. As James walked his parents to the door, his mother pulled him aside. "James," she said softly, her eyes searching his face, "I'm proud of you." He answered questions when she felt overwhelmed, offered reassurance when she faltered, and stood firm in his commitment to support her through this journey. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself marveling at the strength of his family. Despite the shock and the challenges ahead, they had come together, united in their love for Emma and their determination to support her. "We're all here to support you, whatever you choose." As the conversation continued, James felt a shift in the atmosphere. The initial tension and fear began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. His parents asked questions, offered support, and most importantly, showered Emma with love and acceptance. Throughout it all, James remained by Emma's side, his hand never leaving hers. "And the father?" he asked, his tone careful. "Is he in the picture?" Emma's face crumpled at the question, and James instinctively reached out to take her hand. That's something we're still figuring out," he said, giving Emma's hand a gentle squeeze. "Right now, we're focusing on Emma and her well-being." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Of course," she said. "Emma, dear, you don't have to make any decisions right now." "Have you thought about what you want to do?" Margaret asked gently, looking between Emma and James. Emma bit her lip, glancing at her father before responding. We have an appointment with an obstetrician next week," she said, "to discuss our options." James nodded, adding, "We're taking this one step at a time. Right now, our focus is on making sure Emma is healthy and supported." Robert cleared his throat, his brow furrowed in thought. "This is a big thing you're facing. But mad? Never." Robert, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Emma," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "you're our granddaughter. Nothing will ever change that. We're here for you, whatever you need." James watched as Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly, the fear in her eyes giving way to relief. He felt a surge of gratitude towards his parents, for their unconditional love and support. "But what's important now is that we support Emma and help her through this difficult time." Margaret reached out, placing her hand over Emma's. "Of course we'll support you, dear," she said softly. "We love you, no matter what." Emma looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. You're not mad at me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, Emma," Margaret sighed, squeezing her hand. "We're not mad. We're worried, yes." "Why don't we all sit down?" James suggested, gesturing to the kitchen table. "We've made some coffee." As they settled around the table, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Emma kept her eyes fixed on her hands, unable to meet her grandparents' gaze. James cleared his throat, realizing it was up to him to break the ice. "I know this news comes as a shock," he began, his voice steady. "It was a shock to me, too, when Emma told me yesterday." "Emma, sweetheart," Margaret breathed, rushing forward to envelop her granddaughter in a tight embrace. Emma stiffened for a moment before melting into her grandmother's arms, tears welling up in her eyes once more. Robert hung back, his expression a mixture of concern and something James couldn't quite read. Disappointment, perhaps, or regret. James felt a pang of guilt, knowing that his own absent parenting had likely contributed to this situation. Her eyes darted past him, searching for Emma. "Where is she?" "Mom, Dad," James greeted them, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. "Come in. Emma's in the kitchen." As they stepped into the foyer, James could feel the weight of unspoken questions and concerns hanging heavy between them. He led them to the kitchen, where Emma stood nervously by the counter, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family, united, resilient, and stronger than ever before. James gave Emma's shoulder a reassuring squeeze before moving to answer the door. As he reached for the handle, he took a deep breath, centering himself for the conversation to come. He opened the door to reveal his parents, Margaret and Robert Carver, their faces etched with concern and barely concealed anxiety. "James," his mother said, her voice tight with emotion. James moved to stand beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Remember," he said softly, "we're in this together. No matter what happens, no matter what is said, I'm right here with you." Emma nodded, taking a deep breath of her own. As the doorbell rang, echoing through the house, father and daughter exchanged a look of mutual support and determination. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and hard decisions. But for the first time in a long time, James felt truly alive, truly present in his own life and in his daughter's. As he heard the distant sound of a car pulling into the driveway, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "They're here," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked out the window. "I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together, remember?" As they moved around the kitchen, tidying up and preparing for the impending visit, James found himself reflecting on the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. His world had been turned upside down, his carefully constructed life plan shattered. And yet, as he watched Emma move about the kitchen, her movements tentative but determined, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. "Your grandmother always says a crisis is best faced with a good cup of coffee." Emma managed a watery laugh, nodding as she pulled away to wipe her eyes. "Okay," she agreed. "But Dad, will you stay with me when they get here? I don't think I can face them alone." James felt his heart swell with a mixture of love and regret. How many times had Emma needed him like this over the years, only to find herself alone? "Of course, sweetheart," he said softly. This was his chance to be the father he should have been all along, to protect and support his daughter through what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging periods of her life. "Now," he said, wiping away her tears with his thumbs, We have an hour before Hurricane Grandma and Grandpa arrive. What do you say we tidy up a bit and maybe make some coffee? What if they hate me? James pulled back, cupping Emma's face in his hands and looking her in the eyes. Emma, listen to me. No one hates you. Are they surprised? Yes. Concerned? Absolutely. But hate? Never. You are loved, unconditionally. By me, by your grandparents, by this whole family. We're all going to get through this together. As Emma nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, James felt a fierce determination well up inside him. James nodded, pulling her into a hug. They are, he confirmed. But Emma, listen to me. Your grandparents love you. Yes, they'll be shocked, maybe even upset at first, but they're coming because they care about you, about us. Emma buried her face in her father's shoulder, her body trembling slightly. I'm scared, Dad, she admitted. What if they're disappointed in me? We're coming over, and that's final. Despite the seriousness of the situation, James felt a small smile tug at his lips. His mother's fierce protectiveness, a trait he had inherited but had forgotten how to express, was coming to the forefront. All right, Mom, he conceded. We'll see you in an hour. As he hung up the phone, James turned to Emma, who looked like she might be sick. They're coming over, aren't they? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then his mother's voice came back, clearer and more determined. We're coming over, she announced. Your father and I will be there in an hour. James felt Emma stiffen beside him, her eyes widening in panic. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze before responding. Mom, I don't think that's necessary right now. Emma and I are still... James Alexander Carver, his mother interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. Our granddaughter needs us. For years, he had been an absent father, prioritizing his career over his family. This sudden united front was as surprising to his parents as Emma's pregnancy. Yes, Mom, James said firmly. I know I haven't been there for Emma the way I should have been. That's changing now. We're in this together. He heard a muffled conversation on the other end of the line, presumably his mother relaying the news to his father. We have an appointment with an obstetrician next week to confirm everything and discuss our options. Another pause. And then, how is Emma doing? Is she all right? James glanced at his daughter, who was watching him intently, her face pale with anxiety. We're both processing this, he said carefully. It's a lot to take in, but we're facing it together. Together, his mother repeated, and James could hear the unspoken question in her voice. As James explained the situation to his mother, he could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. There was a moment of heavy silence, and he tightened his grip on Emma's hand, bracing for the reaction. Oh, James, his mother finally said, her voice a mixture of concern and disbelief. Emma is... Are you sure? Yes, Mom, James replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. We're sure. Emma and I have some news to share with you and Dad. Do you have a moment to talk? As he began to explain the situation, James felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This conversation was just the beginning of a long and challenging journey. But for the first time in years, he felt truly present, truly engaged in his life and his role as a father. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it head-on, with Emma by his side. Whatever reaction awaited them on the other end of the line, they would face it together. Because that's what family did. They stood by each other, through the easy times and the hard, through joy and sorrow, through expected milestones and unexpected challenges. The line clicked as someone picked up. Hello? Came his mother's familiar voice. James took a deep breath, squeezing Emma's hand. Hi, Mom, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've got your back." As James reached for his phone once more, he felt a mix of trepidation and determination. Telling his parents about Emma's pregnancy would be difficult, but it was a necessary step in their new journey together. He dialed the number, his free hand still holding Emma's, offering silent support. As the phone rang, James caught Emma's eye and gave her an encouraging smile. "Do we have to?" she asked, her voice small. James nodded, understanding her apprehension, but knowing it was necessary. "They're family, Emma. They love you. Yes, this news will be a shock, but they'll want to support you. Support us." Emma bit her lip, considering his words. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she agreed. "But can you do the talking?" James smiled, pulling her into a one-armed hug. "Of course. We're a team now, remember?" But in this moment, there was a newfound strength in their bond, a resilience born from shared vulnerability and mutual support. "So," Emma said after a while, sitting up straighter, "what's next on our to-do list?" James took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next hurdle. "I think it's time we call your grandparents," he said. "They should hear this news from us, not through the grapevine." Emma tensed beside him, fear flashing across her face. "Oh, but we're here now, right?" James felt a surge of pride at his daughter's wisdom. "Right," he agreed. "We're here now, and we're going to face whatever comes next, together." As they sat there, the morning sun streaming through the kitchen windows, James felt a shift in the air between them. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with challenges neither of them could fully anticipate. "In that moment, I knew I would do anything to protect you, to give you the best life possible." He paused, regret washing over him. "I thought that meant providing for you financially, giving you every material comfort. I see now that I missed what was truly important." Emma leaned into her father's side, resting her head on his shoulder. "We can't change the past, Dad," she said softly. "The thought of being responsible for a tiny human being, it was overwhelming." "What changed?" Emma asked, curiosity replacing some of the fear in her eyes. "The moment I held you in my arms," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "All that fear, all that uncertainty, it didn't disappear, but it was overshadowed by this incredible love I felt for you. You know," he began, a small smile tugging at his lips, "when your mother told me she was pregnant with you, I was terrified." Emma looked up, surprise evident on her face. "You were?" James nodded, chuckling softly at the memory. "Absolutely. I was just starting my residency, working insane hours, barely sleeping. But we're in this together now." As they sat there, father and daughter united in their uncertainty and fear, James felt a fierce protectiveness wash over him. He had spent so many years shielding himself from emotional vulnerability, but now, faced with Emma's need, he found a strength he didn't know he possessed. He moved to sit beside her, gently taking her hand in his. "Emma, listen to me," he said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. We're going to take this one step at a time, okay? And whatever you decide, whatever path you choose, I'll be right here with you." Emma nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," James replied, squeezing her hand. "I am too. She's pregnant." As he provided the necessary details, James saw Emma's eyes widen, the gravity of the situation hitting her anew with each piece of information shared. When he hung up, having secured an appointment for the following week, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. What if I'm not ready for this?" James felt his heart constrict at the vulnerability in her voice. The reality of their situation was settling in, bringing with it a new wave of anxiety for both of them. When a cheerful receptionist finally answered, James found himself stumbling over his words, a far cry from his usual confident demeanor in medical settings. "Yes, I'd like to schedule an appointment for my daughter," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. It was time to start making those calls, to take the first steps on this new path. As he dialed the number for the obstetrician's office, he caught Emma's eye and smiled. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family, stronger, more united, and more determined than ever before. As James waited on hold with the obstetrician's office, he watched Emma nervously fidget with her napkin. "I know." As they broke apart, both wiping away tears, James felt a surge of determination. The future was uncertain, but he was ready to face it with open arms. Because now, he understood that true healing wasn't just about mending bodies. It was about mending hearts, rebuilding relationships, and finding the courage to start anew, no matter how daunting the journey might seem. With a deep breath, James picked up his phone. He was James, father to Emma, soon to be grandfather, and a man learning that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become the person you were always meant to be. As Emma stood to clear the dishes, James stopped her, pulling her into a hug. "We're going to get through this," he murmured into her hair. "Together." Emma's arms tightened around him. "I know, Dad," she whispered. "I really would." As they finished their breakfast, making plans for the day ahead, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and unexpected turns. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face those challenges head-on. Because now, he wasn't just Dr. James Carver, renowned surgeon. "I'd like us to start seeing a family therapist. I think we have a lot to work through, you and I want to make sure we're both equipped to handle the challenges ahead." For a moment, Emma was silent, and James feared he had pushed too far, too fast. But then she looked up, a small smile on her face. "I'd like that, Dad," she said. "They'll be so disappointed in me. Grandma will probably have a heart attack." James reached across the table, taking Emma's hand in his. "Emma, listen to me. This family has weathered a lot of storms over the years. Yes, this news will be a shock, but they love you. They'll support you, just like I will." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, but she nodded, squeezing her father's hand. "And there's one more thing," James added, his voice softening. "First," James continued, "I think we need to schedule an appointment with an obstetrician. It's important that we get you and the baby the best care possible." Emma nodded, relief evident in her eyes. "Okay," she said softly. "What else?" "Well," James said, taking a deep breath, "I think it's time we tell the rest of the family. Your grandparents, your Aunt Sarah, they should know what's going on." Emma's fork clattered to her plate. "Dad, no." It was a simple activity, but to James, it felt monumental. This was the kind of moment he had missed out on for so many years, the kind of everyday interaction that built the foundation of a strong relationship. As they sat down to eat their slightly misshapen but delicious breakfast, James cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what our next steps should be." Emma looked up from her plate, her expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "I need some help," he offered, stepping into the kitchen. Emma looked up, a mixture of surprise and embarrassment on her face. "I wanted to make breakfast," she explained. "But I think I might be in over my head," James chuckled, moving to stand beside her. "Well, lucky for you, your old man makes a mean pancake. Want me to show you?" For the next hour, father and daughter worked side by side, mixing batter, flipping pancakes, and laughing at their mistakes. It was time to remember who James Carver was beyond the title of doctor. With this resolution in mind, James finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with images of new beginnings and second chances. The next morning, James woke to the unfamiliar sound of activity in the kitchen. Curious, he made his way downstairs to find Emma at the stove, attempting to make pancakes. The sight of her, hair messy and brow furrowed in concentration, brought a smile to his face. But now, as he lay in the dark, James realized that it wasn't too late to reclaim some of that lost passion, that zest for life beyond his career. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his curtains, James made a decision. He would not only support Emma through her pregnancy, but he would use this time to rediscover himself as well. There had been a time when he'd wanted to travel, to explore the world beyond the sterile walls of hospitals and operating rooms. He'd wanted to learn to play the guitar, to write poetry, to fall in love deeply and without reservation. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had been set aside, replaced by the single-minded pursuit of professional success. His mind raced with thoughts of the future, plans forming and reforming as he stared at the ceiling. The enormity of the changes ahead was daunting, but beneath the anxiety, there was a current of excitement he hadn't felt in years. He found himself thinking back to his own youth, to the dreams and aspirations he'd had before the pursuit of medical excellence had consumed his life. As James headed to his own room, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he would face them with Emma by his side. And somehow, he knew that together, they would find their way through whatever lay ahead. As James settled into bed that night, sleep eluded him. James Carver, renowned surgeon. He was James, father to Emma, soon-to-be grandfather, and a man learning that true success couldn't be measured in awards or accolades, but in the strength of the bonds we forge with those we love. As they reached Emma's room, James pulled her into one last hug. "Good night, Emma," he said softly. "I love you." Emma's arms tightened around him. "I love you too, Dad," she whispered. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, a space where father and daughter could rebuild their relationship, one conversation at a time. As they walked down the hallway together, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult decisions and uncertain outcomes, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face those challenges head-on. Because now, he wasn't just doctor. "We need to find you a good obstetrician. And I think we should look into family counseling." Emma nodded, a look of relief washing over her face. "I'd like that," she said softly. As they stood to leave the office, James took one last look at the bare walls and the single photograph on his desk. The room no longer felt like a shrine to his professional achievements. As they pulled apart, James saw a new light in Emma's eyes, a mixture of hope and determination that mirrored his own feelings. "So," Emma said, wiping away a stray tear. "What's our next step?" James smiled, squeezing her hand. "Well, I think our next step is to get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll start making some calls." "Really?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James nodded, reaching out to take her hand. "Really? We have a lot of lost time to make up for, and a lot of challenges ahead. I want to be here for all of it, the good, the bad, and everything in between." Emma leaned forward, wrapping her arms around her father in a tight embrace. James held her close, marveling at how such a simple act could feel so profound. "I'm going to step down as chief of surgery." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "Dad, no. You can't give up your career because of me. I never meant—" James held up a hand, silencing her protests. "I'm not giving up my career, Emma. I'm just reprioritizing. I'll still be a surgeon, still save lives, but I won't let it consume me anymore. Not at the cost of being there for you." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, but this time they were accompanied by a smile. "I did. I think it's time for a change." Emma turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "What kind of change?" James set his mug down, turning to face his daughter fully. "Emma, I've been thinking a lot about what you said earlier, about feeling unseen. I want you to know that's going to change, starting now." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I thought you might like some." James felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the offered beverage. "Thank you, Emma," he said, taking the mug from her. "Would you like to join me?" Emma nodded, and together they settled onto the small sofa in the corner of the office. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, sipping their tea and absorbing the changes in the room. "You took down your awards," Emma observed, her voice neutral. James nodded. With a start, James realized he had been standing in the dark office for some time, lost in thought. He switched on the desk lamp, its warm glow illuminating the now bare walls. The sight was both unsettling and oddly freeing. A soft knock on the doorframe drew his attention. Emma stood there, a tentative smile on her face. "I made some tea," she said, holding out a steaming mug. As he worked, James found himself thinking about the hospital, about the surgeries he had scheduled for the coming weeks. For the first time in his career, he felt a disconnect from the work that had once consumed him. It wasn't that he no longer cared about his patients or the lives he could save. Rather, he was beginning to understand that there was a balance he had never achieved, a balance between being Dr. Carver, the renowned surgeon, and James, the father. One by one, he took down the framed awards and certificates that had once been his pride and joy. As he held each one, he realized how hollow they felt now, how insignificant in the face of the challenge he and Emma were facing. In their place, he set the photograph of Emma on her 10th birthday. It would serve as a reminder of what he had almost lost and what he was now determined to reclaim: his relationship with his daughter. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, James turned away from the window, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. The carefully constructed world he had built was indeed changing. But with that change came an unexpected sense of liberation. For years, he had been trapped in a prison of his own making, a gilded cage of success and accolades that had left no room for the things that truly mattered. With a deep breath, James began to clear his desk. The world he had built so carefully was changing, transforming into something he couldn't control or predict. But as he watched the sky turn from blue to brilliant orange, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and decisions he never thought he'd have to face. But for the first time in a long time, Dr. James Carver was ready to step into the unknown, with his daughter by his side. As Emma stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Dad," she said, turning back to him, "thank you for listening, for being here." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said softly. "But I promise you, Emma, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." As Emma left the room, James turned to look out the window at the setting sun. For the first time, James saw his daughter not as a child to be protected or a problem to be solved, but as a young woman facing an incredibly difficult situation with courage and maturity beyond her years. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the office, James and Emma had made no firm decisions, but they had made a start at rebuilding their relationship, at facing this unexpected challenge as a united front, step by step. As they began to talk, really talk, about the options ahead, James felt a shift within himself. The drive to control, to have all the answers, began to loosen its grip. Instead, he found himself truly listening to Emma, to her fears, her hopes, her thoughts on the future. They stayed like that for a long time, father and daughter, beginning to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. When Emma's tears finally subsided, she pulled back, wiping her eyes. "What do we do now, Dad?" James took a deep breath, realizing that for once in his life, he didn't have a clear plan, a set procedure to follow. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out together." I'm ashamed of myself for not being the father you deserved." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken feelings and missed connections. But as Emma's tears spilled over, James found himself moving around the desk, kneeling beside her chair and, for the first time in years, pulling her into a tight embrace. As Emma sobbed into his shoulder, James felt his own eyes grow damp. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm here for you. We'll face this together." Emma looked up at him, surprise and gratitude mingling in her expression. "You mean that? You're not ashamed of me?" The question hit James like a physical blow. Had he really been so cold, so distant, that his own daughter would think he could be ashamed of her? "No, Emma," he said firmly, squeezing her hand. "I could never be ashamed of you." It was a novel experience for both of them, this act of truly listening, truly engaging. "I'm scared, Dad," Emma admitted, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know if I'm ready to be a mother, but I don't know if I can—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. James felt his heart constrict, understanding the weight of the decision she was grappling with. "Emma," he said gently, reaching across the desk to take her hand. As Emma settled into the chair across from him, he noticed how small she looked, how vulnerable. Yet there was a strength in her eyes that he had never noticed before, a resilience born from years of navigating life largely on her own. "I've been thinking," Emma began, her voice quiet but steady, "about the baby, about everything." James leaned forward, giving her his full attention. He had promised himself then that he would give Emma the world, that he would make sure she never wanted for anything. But in his determination to be the provider, he had forgotten to be the nurturer. A soft knock on the door pulled James from his reverie. He looked up to see Emma standing in the doorway, hesitant and unsure. "Dad, can we talk?" James nodded, gesturing for her to come in. All the bicycles, all the expensive gadgets, all the lavish vacations, none of it could replace the simple act of being present, of listening, of showing love not through things, but through time and attention. James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as memories washed over him. He remembered the day Emma's mother left, the confusion and hurt in his little girl's eyes. "I thought providing for her, giving her everything she could want, I thought that was enough." But now, faced with the reality of Emma's pregnancy, James was forced to confront the truth he had been avoiding for years. Material possessions couldn't fill the void left by an absent parent. James remembered the day clearly. He had rushed home from a surgery, arriving just in time to present her with the gift before being called back to the hospital for an emergency. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he murmured to himself, tracing Emma's face in the photograph. Now, as he sat in his home office, staring unseeing at the wall of achievements before him, James found himself on a journey of intense self-reflection. Each award, each accolade that had once filled him with pride, now seemed to mock him, highlighting the areas of his life where he had truly failed. He picked up a framed photograph from his desk, a picture of Emma on her 10th birthday. Her smile was wide, her eyes sparkling with joy as she hugged a new bicycle. The days that followed Emma's revelation were a blur of conflicting emotions and sleepless nights for James. He had taken an unprecedented step in his career, requesting a week of personal leave. The hospital board had been surprised, even concerned, but James had been adamant. For once in his life, his family needed to come first. Not as the perfect, infallible figure he had always tried to be, but as the father Emma needed, flawed, human, and wholly committed to walking this unexpected path by her side. As the new day dawned, bringing with it a future neither of them could have imagined, James and Emma faced it together, two imperfect people, bound by blood and a newfound understanding, ready to weather whatever storms lay ahead. James Carver, the man who had always prided himself on having everything under control, realized that sometimes the bravest thing one could do was to admit they didn't have all the answers. And as he looked at his daughter, vulnerable yet stronger than he had ever given her credit for, he made a silent vow. No matter what came next, no matter how his carefully constructed world might crumble around him, he would be there. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, father and daughter sat side by side, the silence between them no longer a barrier but a shared space of understanding. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges neither of them could yet foresee. But in that moment, as the world outside began to stir, a fundamental shift had occurred within the walls of the Carver home. Doctor, but this was uncharted territory. I don't know, he admitted, and the honesty of it felt strangely liberating. But we'll figure it out. Together. For the first time that night, a small smile tugged at the corners of Emma's lips. It was a fragile thing, but it held the promise of hope. We're going to face this together. As the words left his mouth, James realized he meant them with every fiber of his being. The world as he knew it had shattered, but from the broken pieces, he was determined to build something new, something better. What are we going to do? Emma asked, her voice small and uncertain. James took a deep breath. He was used to having all the answers, to knowing exactly what steps to take in any given situation. It was perhaps the first time she had ever heard her father admit to being wrong. I was scared to tell you, she confessed. I thought you'd be so angry, that you'd send me away. James felt his heart constrict at her words. Had he really become so distant, so unapproachable that his own daughter feared his reaction to her crisis? No, Emma, he said firmly, squeezing her hand. I would never send you away. He remembered the day Emma was born, how tiny and perfect she had seemed in his arms. He recalled her first steps, her first words, the way she used to look at him with pure adoration. When had that changed? When had he stopped being her hero and become a stranger in his own home? I'm so sorry, Emma, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I've failed you in so many ways. Emma looked up at him, surprise flickering across her tear-stained face. He heard about secret meetings, whispered promises, and a desperate need for connection that he, in his absence, had failed to provide. I just wanted to feel seen, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyler made me feel like I mattered. The words struck James like a physical blow. How had he missed this? How had he become so blind to his own daughter's needs? As Emma continued her story, James found himself transported back in time. All that mattered was the girl in front of him, his daughter, who needed her father more than ever before. As Emma's words poured out, James felt a whirlwind of emotions. Shock gave way to anger, then to guilt, and finally settled into a deep, aching sadness. He learned of a boy named Tyler, a charming senior who had swept Emma off her feet with promises of love and understanding. "Tell me everything." As Emma began to speak, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word, James listened. For the first time in years, he truly listened to his daughter, pushing aside his shock, his anger, his fear of what this meant for their future. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not his career, not his reputation, not the carefully constructed life he'd built. He saw the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty, the silent plea for help, and he realized that no matter how unprepared he felt, no matter how much this revelation shook his world, Emma needed him now more than ever. Taking a deep breath, James reached out and tentatively took Emma's hand in his. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the beginning of a bridge across the vast chasm that had grown between them. "All right," he said softly. "Let's start from the beginning." But then she turned, and he saw a glimmer of the little girl she once was, the one who used to run to him with skinned knees and bad dreams, looking to him to make everything better. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's talk." As they sat back down, the weight of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. James looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in years. Not when everything was falling apart. "Wait," he called out, his voice softer now. "Please, Emma, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out what to do." Emma paused at the doorway, her back to him. For a moment, James thought she might keep walking, might shut him out completely. He'd been so focused on providing for Emma, on giving her every material comfort, that he'd neglected the one thing she truly needed: his love, his presence, his understanding. "Emma, he began, but she cut him off. "Save it, Dad," she said, rising from the sofa. "I don't need your lectures or your disappointment. I thought you should know." As Emma moved to leave the room, James felt a surge of panic. He couldn't let her go. Not like this. "It's not like I've seen much of it in this house." The words hit James like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he defend himself against a truth he'd been avoiding for years? As the silence stretched between them, James felt the weight of his failures as a father crushing down on him. "I thought—" "Love," James scoffed, anger and disbelief coloring his words. "You're 15, Emma. You don't know anything about love." As soon as the words left his mouth, James regretted them. He saw the hurt flash across Emma's face, saw her walls go up. It was a look he recognized, the same one he saw in the mirror every day. "You're right," Emma said, her voice suddenly cold. "How could I know anything about love?" James stood abruptly, his legs carrying him to the other side of the room before he even realized he'd moved. He ran a hand through his hair, his carefully maintained composure crumbling with each passing second. "How?" he demanded, his voice rising. "How could this happen? Who did this to you?" Emma flinched at his tone, shrinking further into herself. It wasn't like that, Dad. It was... I thought he loved me." His mind raced, trying to process what he'd just heard. Pregnant? His Emma? His 15-year-old daughter? That's impossible," he stammered, the usually eloquent surgeon at a loss for words. "You're just a child. You can't be—" But the look on Emma's face told him it was all too real. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, confirming his worst fears. Physical affection had never come easily to him, especially not since her mother left. "What is it, Emma?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, professional, the same tone he used with patients when delivering difficult news. Emma took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "Dad, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. James felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. But it was the look in her eyes that truly alarmed him, a mixture of fear, shame, and something else he couldn't quite place. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need to tell you something." James felt a chill run down his spine. In that moment, he knew whatever Emma was about to say would change everything. He moved to sit beside her on the sofa, maintaining a careful distance. For a moment, he was struck by how much she looked like her mother, the same delicate features, the same air of fragility that had once drawn him in and then left him shattered. "Emma," he said softly, stepping into the room, "what are you doing up so late?" Slowly, Emma raised her head, and James felt his heart skip a beat. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks stained with dried tears. The table lamp was on, casting long shadows across the plush carpet. And there, curled up on the oversized leather sofa, was Emma. James paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of his daughter. She looked so small, so vulnerable, her knees drawn up to her chest, her long dark hair hiding her face. Chapter 2. The Discovery That Shakes Everything. James moved through the quiet house, a growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. He'd grown accustomed to coming home to an empty house, but tonight felt different. The air seemed charged with an invisible tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As he approached the living room, a soft glow caught his attention. When was the last time he'd reached out to her? With a heavy sigh, James gathered his things and headed home. The sun had long since set, and the streets of Beverly Hills were quiet as he pulled into his driveway. The house loomed before him, dark and imposing. For the first time, James felt a sense of trepidation as he approached his own front door. As he stepped into the foyer, James called out, "Emma, are you home?" The silence that greeted him was deafening. The boy's mother, tears streaming down her face, hugged him tightly, whispering words of gratitude. It was moments like these that reaffirmed James' belief in his chosen path, that made all the sacrifices seem worthwhile. But as the adrenaline of the successful surgery wore off, and James found himself alone in his office, the nagging feeling of unease returned. He glanced at his phone, seeing no messages from Emma. When was the last time she'd reached out to him? He'd deal with it later. Right now, he had lives to save. As he scrubbed in for his final surgery of the day, James pushed thoughts of Emma and the counselor's call to the back of his mind. He couldn't afford distractions, not when he was about to perform a delicate heart procedure on a 5-year-old boy. Hours later, as James emerged from the OR, exhausted but triumphant, he was met with a round of applause from the waiting family. Her voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of concern that James couldn't quite place. "Dr. Carver, this is Sarah Thompson from Westview High. I was hoping we could schedule a meeting to discuss Emma. There are some concerns we'd like to address. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." James' finger hovered over the callback button for a moment before he shook his head. It was probably nothing. Typical teenage drama, he reasoned. As the day progressed, James moved from one surgery to the next with precision and focus. His hands were steady, his decisions swift and sure. In the operating room, he was in his element, commanding his team with the authority of a general and the skill of an artist. It was during a brief break between surgeries that James noticed a missed call from Emma's school. A slight frown creased his brow as he listened to the voicemail from the school counselor. "Ms. Thompson." But for a fleeting moment, James saw something else in those eyes, a flicker of emptiness, a hint of the price he'd paid for his success. Pushing the thought aside, James stepped out of the car, straightened his tie, and strode towards the hospital entrance. The automatic doors parted before him, and he stepped into his kingdom, ready to face another day of triumphs and challenges, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing in his own home. In the OR, he wasn't a distant father or a lonely man. He was a savior, a miracle worker, someone who mattered. The hospital loomed ahead, a gleaming tower of glass and steel. As James pulled into his reserved parking spot, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at him looked confident, assured, ready to take on the world. Little did he know that in a few short hours, his carefully constructed world would begin to crumble, all because of a truth he never saw coming, a truth about the daughter he barely knew. As James navigated the busy Los Angeles streets, his mind was already in the operating room. He visualized the procedure ahead, mentally preparing for every possible complication. This was where he felt most comfortable, most himself. Shaking off the unsettling thought, James slid into his sleek sports car and roared down the driveway. The day ahead was full of challenges he knew how to face, lives to save, decisions to make, a hospital to run. These were the things he excelled at, the arena where he felt most alive and in control. A text from his assistant reminded him of his first surgery in an hour. Without a second thought, he gulped down the rest of his coffee, grabbed his briefcase, and headed for the door. As he stepped out into the warm California morning, James paused for a moment, looking back at the grand house behind him. It was a monument to his success. But in that instant, it felt more like a mausoleum, beautiful, impressive, and utterly devoid of life. It had seemed like the right thing to do at the time, provide for her, give her every material comfort, ensure her future was secure. But somewhere along the way, in his pursuit of excellence and his desire to give Emma everything he thought she needed, James had lost sight of what she truly required: his time, his attention, his presence. The sudden vibration of his phone pulled James from his reverie. He had a full day ahead, 3 back-to-back surgeries followed by a board meeting. There was no time for distractions or sentimentality. As he sipped his coffee, staring out at the meticulously manicured garden, James' mind wandered to Emma. She had been so young when her mother left, barely 5 years old. He'd thrown himself into his work then, using it as a shield against the pain of abandonment and the daunting task of single fatherhood. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually seen Emma, let alone had a conversation with her. When had she left the note? Yesterday. The day before. The realization that he couldn't pinpoint when he'd last interacted with his own daughter sent a pang of guilt through his chest. James crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, pushing the uncomfortable feelings aside as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The staff wouldn't arrive for another hour. He preferred to start his days in solitude, a habit born from years of putting his career before everything else. Entering the kitchen, James' eyes fell on a crumpled piece of paper on the otherwise immaculate counter. Curious, he unfolded it, recognizing the looping handwriting of his 15-year-old daughter. Emma, gone to Lily's to study. Don't wait up. E. A frown creased James' brow. But behind the crisp white shirt and tailored suit, behind the confident smile and steady hands that had saved countless lives, there was a void, a chasm of loneliness that no amount of professional success could fill. As James made his way down the sweeping staircase, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty house. His walls were adorned with accolades, his bank account flush with the fruits of his labor. Yet, as he stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his walk-in closet, James saw a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. His fingers traced the Windsor knot of his tie, a perfect facade to match the carefully constructed image he presented to the world. Stay tuned to find out how this life-changing revelation pushes him to reevaluate what truly matters in life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable stories like this one. At 45 years old, Dr. James Carver was the epitome of success in the medical world. Chief of surgery at one of Los Angeles' most prestigious hospitals, his name was synonymous with groundbreaking procedures and life-saving operations. A doctor's world crumbles. The unbelievable truth about his teenage daughter. Imagine having everything you've ever wanted: success, wealth, prestige, only to discover that one secret could destroy it all. Dr. James Carver, a renowned surgeon, thought he had it all together until the day he learned a shocking truth about his 15-year-old daughter that would turn his world upside down.